All right, I will call this meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee to order. Will the secretary please take the roll?
Senator Harris. Senator Dondero Loop. Senator Orenshaw. Senator Wynn. Senator Hansen. Senator Krasner. Senator Stone. Chair Scheibel.
Here, everybody is present, and we have two bills on for hearing today. And I have confirmed that we have both the permission and the ability to hear them together. So today I will be opening up the hearings on SB 343 and SB 35 and welcoming our sponsors to the table along with any other co-presenters to present them whenever you're ready.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Chair Scheibel, and members of the committee. My name is Aaron Ford, and I am your Attorney General. Come before you today as the state's top law enforcement officer to discuss a bill that will give our state a new tool to fight the opioid epidemic by adjusting the law related to illicit fentanyl and penalties associated with its unlawful possession, manufacturing, distribution, and trafficking. Specifically, this bill makes an amount of fentanyl between 14 and 28 grams enough for a mid-level trafficking charge, and an amount of 28 grams or more enough for a high-level trafficking charge. And Senate Bill 35 is also amended to define fentanyl as illicitly manufactured fentanyl, as opposed to Schedule II fentanyl, which has illegitimate medical use. Before I go further, I want to be clear about what this bill is and what it is not, what it intends to do and what it does not intend to do. And to be perfectly frank, I've had dreams and frankly nightmares over ensuring that in pursuing this bill, we don't recreate the war on drugs from the crack cocaine days. And that's why I want to talk about what this bill does. And to do that, I'd like to invoke at least in my mind, a popular television show to demonstrate. It's a show called Snowfall. I don't know if you've ever watched Snowfall. If not, I commend that to the members for your binge watching. It's actually a good show. It's a story about, according to FX's description, how, and I quote, how crack began. The show chronicles how an off-the-books CIA operation contributed to the destruction rock cocaine leveled upon South Central LA. This bill goes after certain characters that I'm going to reference. It goes after Teddy McDonald, who is a CIA agent who buys cocaine from Central and South America and manufactures it for sale in South Central. It also goes after Oso, who helps Teddy secure and distribute that cocaine. This bill goes after Franklin Saint, who buys the cocaine from Teddy and runs the enterprise that manufactures crack, which involved the cooking and rocking up of the cocaine that was to be distributed. This bill goes after Franklin's aunt and uncle, Louis and Jerome, who helped to distribute into the communities this crack cocaine. And yes, it goes after Leon, who is one of Franklin's childhood friends, who also distributes crack and oversees others who sell it. This bill, however, is not intended to go after Wanda. Wanda uses crack and is addicted to crack. To be sure, Wanda, when she was actually cooking up the crack to be sold, this bill will go after her too. But in her status as an addict, she's secondary under this bill. Stated succinctly, I'm not trying to recreate the war on drugs during the crack cocaine era, contrary to anything any person in opposition will say. We made mistakes then, and we need to learn from those mistakes. We don't want to repeat those mistakes here. That's why this bill is not intended to go after those who are struggling with addiction. We learned that incarceration does not help those who need help unless help is offered during incarceration. That's why I am requesting that we amend Senate Bill 35 to include medication-assisted treatment, called MAT, for short, so that jails and prisons can offer help to those finding themselves incarcerated. We've had conversations with addiction and recovery stakeholders who proposed more resources for Matt, and I support this. To be clear, that's exactly where the amendment came from, conversations with the recovery community. And a person who may be simply using drugs while struggling with addiction would almost certainly not be in possession of a large amount of fentanyl for personal use. I want to be clear, though, that we are working very closely with stakeholders and concerned parties to ensure that this bill has a minimum amount of impact as possible on those who are addicted to fentanyl or addicted to fentanyl-laced drugs, and not those who are not involved in trafficking. We're listening, and we're very much open to incorporating their concerns into this bill. So what this bill is intended to do is to give law enforcement the tools to go after those who are unlawfully distributing fentanyl and addressing the inherent danger it brings and the death that it causes. This drug is dangerous. This is not a moral crusade against drug use. It is a crusade to save the lives of our fellow Nevadans. We cannot stand idly by and do nothing. I'd also like to note one more thing that this bill is not trying to do. It does not roll back elements of Assembly Bill 236 from the 2017 legislative session. To the contrary, it advances the very policy that it embraced of adjusting weights and penalties based on specific drugs. Indeed, Justice Hardesty testified to this very need, as this following clip demonstrates.
236, though, are just a starting point. I proposed during the subgroup, and I still maintain, that in addition to the changes in the bill, the Sentencing Commission should spend the next interim studying the impacts of different drugs and their quantities on public health and the criminal justice system. As we know, not all drugs are the same, and the quantities of many drugs are extremely impactful, even low quantities. These weight thresholds will be further discussed and evaluated with specific attention to the individual drugs that are affecting our state in the interim by the Sentencing Commission if you pass those recommendations presented to you. This area is discussed in sections 118 through 123.
So, as Justice Hardesty indicated, we needed to take a look at specific drugs to see what specific impact they have on our communities. That's what we're doing here. We are seeking to tighten restrictions on and to enhance penalties related to illicit fentanyl because narcotics do not split into even doses in the same quantities. The gram amounts we're suggesting were determined by looking at possible doses. To make a hypothetical comparison, 100 grams of fentanyl does not contain the same number of doses as 100 grams of, say, cocaine. We're talking about a much higher number of doses of an incredibly dangerous drug when matched weight to weight with the same amount of other drugs. To be sure, we remain open to discussions regarding the final amount in this bill, but we believe that it is too dangerous to not reckon with how many more doses are contained in a gram of fentanyl. When we're discussing trafficking, it's important to keep in mind that the actual amount of a drug that can be distributed or sold. 2 milligrams of fentanyl, 2 milligrams of fentanyl is considered a potentially lethal dose. Think about how many dangerous doses could be with every 4-gram amount, or even a 4-gram amount. It's very lethal, which is why I support Majority Leader Canizaro's bill. She'll be speaking to that, obviously, on her own. 4 grams can be divided into a significantly larger number of doses than the same amount of cocaine, to cite the earlier example. It should be clear then why we cannot treat this like other drugs, why the weights involved are inherently different when talking about a drug that can kill you with such a minuscule amount. Fentanyl is a scourge because of these low dose amounts. It is simply far too easy to overdose. It can be added into other drugs without the user's knowledge as well, which creates a dangerous likelihood of overdose. According to data we received from the Nevada Overdose Data to Action Program, there were 497 overdose deaths in Nevada in 2022, containing a synthetic opioid like fentanyl. This includes fentanyl analogs such as carfentanil. According to DHHS, there were 566 opioid-related deaths in Nevada in 2021. In 59% of these deaths, synthetic opioids like fentanyl were found. 20% of the 566 deaths involved heroin. Think about that for a moment. Fentanyl is involved in essentially 3 times as many deaths as heroin in Nevada. Opioids were also found in over 90% of all multi-drug deaths in 2021, according to GHHS. This is another sign of the extremely concerning problem of dealers intentionally mixing fentanyl in with other drugs, leading consumers to take narcotics without being fully aware of what they're taking. If a person were to take a large dose of cocaine without knowing it had a large amount of fentanyl mixed in, the result can be and generally is deadly. That's just deaths. According to the CDC, in 2022, we had a range between 6.2 and 10.3 people per 100,000 visiting the emergency room with a suspected overdose per month. So, as you can see, and as you have undoubtedly heard, we have a big problem with illicit fentanyl. This bill intends to address some of those problems. Turning to the bill, let me review Senate Bill 35 with you section by section as amended. Our amendment proposes that in Section 1, lines 3 through 9, establish 2 things. First, that the affected chapter of NRS 450 is NRS 453, controlled substances. Second, an amended definition of who is targeted in this bill, and that is a, quote, a person who knowingly or intentionally sells, manufactures, delivers, or brings into this state, or who knowingly or intentionally in actual or constructive possession of illicitly manufactured fentanyl, any derivative of fentanyl, or any mixture which contains fentanyl. Subsection 1, lines 9 through 13 have been removed. That was a section dealing with 4 to 14 grams of fentanyl, and as you will hear later, these amounts are addressed in Majority Leader Canizaro's bill. Subsection 2 creates the crime of mid-level trafficking in fentanyl for those who traffic 14 to 28 grams of illicit fentanyl. This crime will be punishable by a Category B felony, imprisonment for a minimum of 2 years and a maximum of up to 15 years, and a fine of not more than $100,000. Subsection 3 creates the crime of high-level trafficking in fentanyl for those who traffic 28 grams or more. This crime is punishable as a Category A felony for life with the possibility of parole and a minimum of 10 years served, or for a defined term of 25 years with eligibility for parole after a minimum of 10 years and a fine of not more than $500,000. Section 2 adds the provisions of Section 1 to existing statutes regarding unlawful acts related to imitation controlled substances. Section 3 adds the provisions of Section 1 to statutes regarding penalties for making available controlled substances which cause death. Section 4 adds provisions of Section 1 to existing statutes for additional penalty for failure to render or seek medical assistance for a person injured or killed by use of controlled substances under certain circumstances. Section 5 adds provisions of Section 1 to the NRS regarding unlawful possession of a controlled substance without a valid prescription. Section 6 adds provisions of Section 1 to statutes regarding possession for sale of club drugs and MDMA. Section 7 adds provisions of Section 1 to existing language regarding the determination of weights of controlled substances. Section 8 adds provisions of Section 1 to existing language regarding Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substances. I am amending Section 8 with the intent to ensure only Schedule 1 fentanyl is targeted in this bill. Schedule 1 drugs are defined as having a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use and treatment. This is to keep consistent with changes in Section 1 and my goal to target illicitly manufactured fentanyl. It is not my intent to target legally prescribed fentanyl. My amendment also removes a reference to marijuana, as NRS 453.339 specifically addresses trafficking of marijuana. Section 9 ensures the enforcement measures in Section 1 are applied to the statute regarding trafficking of controlled substances. Section 10 adds provisions of Section 1 to the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act. Majority Leader Canizaro will have more to say about that in her bill as well. Section 11 adds mid-level and high-level trafficking of fentanyl to the chapter regarding criminal history records. Section 12 adds the provisions of Section 1 to statutes on crimes related to racketeering. And Section 13 adds mid-level and high-level trafficking of fentanyl to the chapter on personnel as an immoral crime. As I close, I want to note that my administration has been at the forefront of the fight against the opioid epidemic here in Nevada. For example, we worked diligently to help form the One Nevada Agreement, on allocation of opioid recoveries. The agreement is an intrastate allocation agreement with all Nevada counties and litigating cities. It provides a mechanism to allocate recoveries and opioid settlements and bankruptcies between the state, counties, and litigating cities with one purpose: to remediate the harms, risks, and impacts of opioids. We've secured hundreds of millions of dollars in opioid settlements for the state since I took office. Almost 2 years ago today, we announced that the state would see over $70 million brought before costs were taken out. And we haven't stopped working since then. We've continued holding manufacturers, distributors, pharmacies, and others accountable for their roles in the opioid crisis. In fact, we'll be announcing a new settlements in the near future, so stay tuned for that. In 2021, the legislature created the statewide substance use response working group in my office and tasked it with making recommendations to DHHS for the usage of state and local funds for mitigating substance abuse. In late January, our committee released our recommendations, and these included supporting a backbone agency to help improve local data collection systems and create a statewide data sharing system. It included providing a platform of services in schools to connect families to pro-social education, early intervention, counseling services, and more. It included expanding Medicaid billing opportunities for preventive services, and it included ensuring communities of color have access to overdose prevention, recognition, and reversal training. And yes, those recommendations also included revising the penalties for trafficking in fentanyl. This bill is what I'm presenting you today. This recommendation was done with the input of subject matter experts and through a process of 17 public meetings meant to ensure our recommendations were thoroughly vetted and discussed. This bill will give law enforcement the ability it needs to take poison off the street, to keep vulnerable Nevadans from accessing it, and God forbid, from dying from it. And it will ensure that we're taking all steps that we possibly can to mitigate this crisis. I urge your support. With that, I'll tender the mic to your colleague, Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro.
Thank you, Attorney General Ford, members of the committee, Chair Scheibel. My name is Nicole Cannizzaro. I represent Senate District 6 in the northwest portion of the Las Vegas Valley, and I'm here to present to you and walk you through the provisions contained within Senate Bill 343. As my colleague, the Attorney General, mentioned, these two bills are meant to work in tandem, as we both have been intimately aware of the issue that fentanyl has created in our communities and seeking an opportunity to sort of rectify that with the proper balance. And that is the intent of both Senate Bill 35 and Senate Bill 343. I am pleased to be here to be able to present the second of these two companion bills for fentanyl trafficking. And I am extremely honored and humbled to be joined by my friend and colleague, Attorney General Ford. This discussion, I know, is a difficult one, and I would echo the comments of my colleague that our intent is very much not to create a system whereby we are punishing individuals or sending them to prison merely because they happen to have an addiction issue. That is absolutely not what we are trying to do, and that is something that has certainly been a consideration of ours. And I think, to the Attorney General's point, there have been many conversations around both of these bills to talk about that particular issue. While we don't necessarily have perfect statistics in Nevada on just how prevalent fentanyl is in our communities, mostly because we find it often are encountered with it because it is mixed with other substances. And so that makes it very difficult to track specifically those pieces. But there is no doubt that we are seeing an unprecedented increase in opioid overdoses and deaths that can be attributed to fentanyl. You don't have to look very hard to find that. There are plenty of unfortunate stories that we have heard from so many families. And so just by way of example, from July to August of 2022, that is just 1 month, that's 1 month here in Nevada, we saw a 66% increase in opioid-related emergency room visits. From January to July of 2022, Clark County alone saw an estimated 1,412 opioid-related overdoses. And since 2019, statewide opioid overdoses deaths due to fentanyl have increased by 227%. These, for me, are very astounding statistics, and I think speaks to exactly why we are here to try to find the right path to address this issue. These numbers are truly staggering, and they often include first-time or very occasional recreational drug users, including an alarming number of high school-aged kids and other young people. They think they are taking something far less dangerous than fentanyl, and yet they end up taking fentanyl. And if somebody who has unknowingly taken fentanyl is lucky, they will end up in the emergency room that is capable of treating them. But because the drug is so strong and its effects can come on so quickly, many who unwittingly take a counterfeit pill or common club drug that has been laced with fentanyl often do not even make it as far as the emergency room. And I think that that also speaks to even the clip that we heard from Justice Hardesty, that there are some discussions that have to be had in a different context. And I think that fentanyl and its effects certainly warrant us to have this discussion now. We have all heard these horrific stories, and I would wager that every person in this room knows somebody personally who has dealt with the destruction this drug is doing to our families, our friends, our children, and ultimately our state. If anything, the flood of fentanyl seems to be getting worse and quickly, and that is why we must smartly use the tools at our disposal to address this threat. One of those tools is absolutely to go after those who intentionally traffic this incredibly dangerous drug without concern for human life. At the same time, we need to work to help Nevadans who are struggling with addiction. Addiction itself is not a crime, and we should be very clear about that. And we should continue to be compassionate towards those who have found themselves dependent on opioids. As the Attorney General has discussed, and as I will go over in this bill and its amendments, we are intentionally crafting legislation that targets those who are trafficking these drugs, while including provisions that encourage and provide for treatment for those dealing with addiction, and recourse for those acting in good faith to help individuals who are experiencing an overdose. As many of you may know, I have spent a lot of my time in my professional career prosecuting complex criminal cases, many involving criminal gangs, drug trafficking, and related violence. I've also spent quite a bit of time now in this legislature and in this very committee with many of you who sit on this committee, working on policy that touches these issues. And I think it's easy when you are in the political arena and you're dealing with a complex public policy, especially an issue like fentanyl, to fall into a category or a trap of wanting to just look tough all over the place. And I want to approach this issue as someone who, as a former prosecutor, wants laws to be tough and to be fair and to be effective at saving lives. But at the same time, I think we have to make smart policy. We have to craft smart policy. And so I'm less interested in grabbing headlines than I am in trying to solve this issue. I want to make sure that law enforcement has better tools and that they can go after the root of this problem. Drug traffickers are the root of this problem. Individuals who are bringing this intentionally into our communities and targeting especially young, vulnerable kids who are ending up dying as a result of this, or at best in an emergency room situation, are absolutely the issue that we are trying to get at. I think what you'll see in these two bills, some of which has been outlined by the Attorney General and some of which will be contained in this bill, is that we are trying to not only allow those tools to go after those traffickers who are destroying those families, but we are also working to better treat people who have addiction issues and to ensure that we are not unfairly targeting folks that may, in many cases, have innocently been ensnared by the opioid and fentanyl crisis. There's a delicate balance there, and I know that there will be some opposition to this bill, but I think there are, and you will see in these two bills, very intentional pieces that are designed to give tools to law enforcement, but also to recognize that this issue is more complex than just slapping on a hard sentence for violating a statute, and that is not what we are trying to do. We are trying to be smart about this policy. So I want to walk the committee through Senate Bill 343. I will let the chair and the members of the committee know that we did have a proposed conceptual amendment. I think it will be very easy to walk through with the committee. It did not end up on Ellis. That is my apologies. We will get that to you as soon as possible. But I think that these amendments are very easy to digest and certainly complement the Attorney General's office. As written, Section 1 of this bill establishes a three-tiered system of offenses and related penalties for knowingly trafficking fentanyl or other derivatives or mixtures containing fentanyl. For the purposes of this bill, trafficking does include knowingly or intentionally selling, manufacturing, delivering, or bringing into Nevada any of these fentanyl-containing substances. The proposed amendment for Senate Bill 343 will remove the mid-level and high-level offenses and those related penalties and retain the low-level trafficking offenses and related penalties. The mid-level and the high-level offenses are addressed in Senate Bill 35. We also want to mirror the definition in Section 1 to ensure that we are addressing illicit fentanyl, as was discussed with Senate Bill 35. Section 8 sets fentanyl apart from other controlled substances, and in Senate Bill 343 will remain the same language that is currently in there. And it sets fentanyl apart by ensuring that a person who is found guilty of any of these offenses and the penalties that go along with whichever level of crime, make sure that they apply regardless of whatever the other penalties may be. Section 8 also includes, and there are additional definitions to ensure that we are addressing specifically that illicit fentanyl and also the derivatives, and I think that's an important part about the fentanyl piece. Fentanyl, as we know it, not in a medical grade fentanyl, but as what you may encounter on the street, and some of the concerns that we have heard, is that it oftentimes is appearing in multiple derivative forms. And so we are intentionally crafting definitions that will allow for us to continue to target those drug traffickers who are dealing with that illicit fentanyl, even if it is a different form of that same derivative. The remaining sections of the bill, I apologize. As amended, the sections that are in Section 8 will apply only to the low-level trafficking offense that will be set forth in Section 1, as we mentioned, being amended. We also, in Section 10, want to ensure that we keep intact, and so we'll be removing that language for the Good Samaritan piece. Good Samaritan laws are intended to allow for individuals who are with someone who is experiencing an overdose or who may be experiencing an overdose to be able to call for assistance without worrying about whether or not they are going to face criminal charges as a result. Oftentimes, and especially in a fentanyl sense, we really are seeing people who may be with a friend who is experiencing an overdose. We want them to be able to call for assistance because of the fast-acting nature of fentanyl. That call for assistance can be the difference between whether someone ends up in an emergency room or ends up dying from the fentanyl, and we want to make sure that that remains intact. I think that that's an important piece so that we can make sure that we are being compassionate in those pieces. That Good Samaritan piece that is present in Section 10 that would have included this as an exception to that, we'll be removing that language so that anyone who is in good faith seeking medical assistance for a person experiencing an overdose or who is seeking such assistance for themselves is not then subject to criminal prosecution just because they were calling for help. We want to make sure that that provision stays intact. Madam Chair, I think with that, the changes for 343 being to conform with the definition of illicit fentanyl in Section 1 of Senate Bill 35. This bill will address the 4 to 14 grams of low-level trafficking offenses. This bill also contains similar language that I think you'll also see reflected in 35 within Section 8 that addresses the derivative formats of fentanyl, and then also that will remain intact those Good Samaritan provisions. That is what Senate Bill 343 will do in substance. That concludes my overview of this bill. I want to thank you and the committee for your time and attention today, and I also want to especially thank Attorney General Ford for his partnership. As a former prosecutor and a member of law enforcement, I have seen firsthand just how devastating fentanyl has been to our community, and I thank the Attorney General for his leadership on this issue. I think that the two of us sitting here hopefully demonstrates just how serious our state government is about addressing this crisis and doing so so in a very smart fashion. I also would be remiss if I did not thank the many individuals and organizations who have been a part of many working groups, mostly led by the Attorney General's office, and who will continue to play a part of the conversation as these bills move through the legislative process. I know that this is, and I hope I can speak for the Attorney General as well, this is by no means an end to this conversation, and you have our commitment that we will continue to work with all good faith actors to ensure that these bills are tailored to address the root cause of the epidemic and not unnecessarily put those who are facing addiction issues in a difficult spot. I think that's what we are intending to do, and so with that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you or the committee may have.
Madam Chair, if you would allow me, indulge me a couple more minutes before you go to questions. Thank you again, Leader Canizaro, for allowing me to work with you on this issue. This is very real. I got goosebumps, bad goosebumps right now. I keep Narcan in my truck because this is such a recurring activity. And Narcan helps to save those who've overdosed on an opioid. This is very real, which is the reason why I have said to you, I've had nightmares about the bill, trying to ensure that we don't, on the one hand, recreate the cocaine crackdown, but at the same time address the fact that this is a very real drug, which is why I want to take a couple of seconds just to address some of the opposition you're going to hear. And we can entertain questions. And I'm going to speak relative to both of the bills because the opposition, at least in one of the letters that I've seen, responds to both of the bills, and it says, and I'm going to quote, and it's in 2023, it says SB 35 and SB 343 is declaring the same state of emergency the war on drugs did in 1973 over trace amounts of fentanyl. First off, it's untrue that we are waging a war on drugs. We have been very clear what we're trying to do here. But let's be clear, trace amounts of fentanyl are killing people. That's why we're here. This bill says that, this letter says that we're not addressing trafficking, sale, and manufacturing of fentanyl that is cut and laced into the drug supply. Nonsense. It further says that the bill seeks to impose draconian penalties on the individuals, users who are buying fentanyl-laced substances for personal use or otherwise intend to possess a different substance. Again, nonsense. You've heard the testimony from us, and the bill itself speaks for itself. We are endeavoring to provide medicated assisted treatment to those who are incarcerated or in jails in order to assist them and to help them. This focus is not on those individuals as described in the letter. There is something that I agree with in this letter, though, and the letter that I'm referencing, just to be clear, is one from Ms. Roth over at the Deputy Public Defender for Washoe County. I just received a copy of it today, so I'm trying to respond to it on the fly. But I do agree with this notion of our drug testing tactics here being qualitative versus quantitative. That's difficult, meaning that if you get a sugar packet, which is 4 grams, that whole sugar packet is going to count as 4 grams. They can't distinguish between whether there was only 1 gram of fentanyl versus all of it being fentanyl. That's the qualitative approach that our drug laws currently operate under. I would love to see, and I'm sorry for springing this on you, Madam Leader, some level of study associated with transitioning our state from qualitative to quantitative so that we can, in fact, make those types of determinations and address it going forward. So I agree with that particular critique, if you will. The letter states that our bills fail to address the public health crisis that stems from the opioid epidemic. And I will say this, I learned in legislation when I was in law school that not every social ill has to be dealt with in one bill. But to be clear, we are endeavoring to apply some public health approaches to this, which is the reason why the medicated assisted treatment is included in SB 35. Suggestions that we received directly from the recovery community. This crisis, I do agree, requires supportive services from our community members grappling with substance use disorder. But there are other opportunities to do that as well. This is a public health crisis, but it is also a public safety issue. Two things can be true at the exact same time, and that's what's happening here. And what we're endeavoring to do is address as much as we can these issues holistically, as the solution component of the letter states, as we can. We do leave it to others who have interests and ideas to present their own in their own bills, and potentially that can supplement what we're doing as well. But make no mistake, from someone who keeps Narcan in his truck, we cannot sit by and do nothing. We must address this. It's killing the clients of some public defenders. It's killing law enforcement as they engage those who have these forms of narcotics. And as the top law enforcement officer in the state, I will not sit idly by and hope that someone else is going to do something. And I would hope again that we're able to continue working with the interest groups on this. I will be happy to receive an amendment to address some of these issues from folks who want to suggest that. But I wanted to make it clear on the record that we are determined to try to make something happen here, and I look forward to working with whomever wants to help us make that happen. Thank you.
All right, thank you both for your presentations, and I am sure we have some questions from members of the committee. Vice Chair Harris, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Given that we don't have the ability currently to separate out how much of what substance is in whatever we're testing, how do we ensure that we don't actually just change the trafficking levels for everything? Because it's my understanding that lots of drugs are cut with fentanyl, right? And so now this is now going to be the floor for cocaine, because if, a good portion of cocaine is cut with fentanyl, and this will now be the trafficking level for essentially any drug that may contain fentanyl in it. How do we avoid that issue?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Madam Chair, to Vice Chair Harris.
You can go direct.
Thank you. And Nicole Canizaro, Senate District 6. So I think that your concern is a well-placed one. But there, quite frankly, and I won't disagree with the Attorney General's suggestion for potentially a study to look at changing and what that would take to ensure that we could do that type of analysis. But I think the reverse of that is true as well. If you simply cut fentanyl with something, then you completely avoid any ability for us to address it as a state. And at the same time, you are still inflicting, I think, the same issue within the community, which is that a very small amount of fentanyl absolutely can and does and has killed people. And so I think that your concern is well placed. But I don't see this as a way for us to just simply change everything into a trafficking level, especially because we are trying to get at that fentanyl piece. And merely cutting it with something else should also not necessarily mean that you can no longer be held accountable, or we just are without a means to address it, because I think that creates, at least in my mind, a loophole where we are allowing for folks to continue to deal in fentanyl in the way that we are seeing it and the way that we are interacting with it in our communities without providing a proper tool. And so I understand that point, but I think that realistically we do have to have some sort of tool to address fentanyl, and you're not going to see I would be remiss, and I would invite anybody who can come up with a different example. You're not going to see a full, a tab or a whole packet full of pure fentanyl. That's just not how fentanyl presents itself. And because, and I think this is one of the differentiation pieces, right? Because it is being addressed in that fashion, we sort of have to address it this way for at least for those two reasons. One, that we currently are incapable of doing that analysis, and two, because otherwise, I think it does create a loophole whereby just because you cut it with something else, now no longer can we address it whatsoever.
And thank you for that response, Majority Leader. I think my concern is actually the opposite way around, that most drugs are cut with fentanyl, not as if they're trying to sell fentanyl and they're cutting it with another drug to make it sellable, but that just the ubiquitousness, which is, again, part of the problem here, right, that I know y'all are trying to address, but it just seems like it would touch upon everything, right? And when we look at not trying to harm the buyer who has 14 grams of cocaine, because that's what they purchased, but it has some trace amounts of fentanyl in it, they are now a trafficker, right? And so I'm trying to figure out how we ensure that we don't make the mistake that I know you all don't want to make, and that is inadvertently go after the people who are maybe purchasing this on the street or the user and has a problem and aren't the person who is out there, pushing these very, very dangerous drugs.
Aaron Ford, for the record, as the Madam Leader said, it's a great question. And the working group is large enough to receive input on how to address that. But the point I made earlier remains the same. I don't believe we can do nothing. Notwithstanding the concern you've raised, I just simply do not believe we can do nothing. This is a drug that is killing people with trace amounts. You know, as I've indicated, I gave you the characters of Snowfall I'm trying to go after, and Wanda is not the one. How do we ensure that that's the case going forward, absent, some different language? I don't know, Madam Senator, and it's a real question, and I acknowledge that, and I'm open to hearing ways in which we can address it.
Are you all aware of, so we know pure fentanyl really doesn't happen often, but are you all aware of what the drug market looks like today? Is there anyone who's bringing cocaine into Nevada that is not in fact cut with fentanyl? Do we know, is there still such a thing as pure cocaine, or is it just an all cocaine supply, meaning all cocaine is now going to be, potentially covered under this bill, or whatever X, Y, or Z drug, right? Is there anything that's pure anymore that wouldn't have fentanyl in it and hence now have this new trafficking limit?
Thank you for the question, Vice Chair Harris. Nicole Canizaro, Senate District 6. So I think to your point, this. So, let me answer that in sort of two ways. So first and foremost, I think most commonly we're seeing fentanyl not necessarily laced in a bag of cocaine, but it is oftentimes in pill form. I think you will hear that from law enforcement who has been dealing with this, and from other medical professionals who deal with the aftermath when there are overdoses and folks showing up in the emergency room. Most common way that you are going to encounter fentanyl is going to be in a pill format. And even to reach some of the levels that are present in these two bills, you have to have an exceptionally large number of pills in order to achieve that. And so I think that's an important point. That doesn't necessarily mean that there couldn't be a bag of 14 grams of cocaine that could be laced with fentanyl. But most of the ways in which we are encountering fentanyl in our communities is in pill form. And to get to that gram level, even for the 4 grams, is a lot of pills. And I will leave that to, I'm sure, some other individuals who can speak with a few more specifics, or we can get that data for you as well. I think, to your point, that is one of the pieces about probably, frankly, all of our drug laws, right? You could have 14 grams of what is some cocaine and some other substance, or a common everyday, kitchen ingredient. It is nonetheless treated as cocaine for the purposes of reaching those trafficking levels. Cocaine obviously is not the 14 grams, right? It'll be more than that. And I think that is true even within, prior legislation that we have addressed and that we have passed, and that is the law here in the state that is meant to address, look, we're not really looking for that person who is in possession. When it comes to fentanyl, and not that there might not be different circumstances, like I said, where you may have a baggie that has that, and how much of that is laced with fentanyl currently, I don't have that data. At this point, we certainly can get it, but for the most part, when we're talking about fentanyl, you're encountering it in pill form. To reach a level that would be touched by these bills is a lot of pills. It's not somebody who has one pill on them who happens to be taking it at a club. And so I think that because that is the practical reality of what we're dealing with, you really are seeing in this, even though there are low levels in trafficking, that it is an attempt to go after folks who are going to have more than that, who are actually looking to sell and to distribute fentanyl into the community.
And one last question, Chair, if I may, thank you. Do you know, Madam Leader, and I understand if you don't, and I can, take this with the officers as they come up. Do you know what it is people think they're buying when they purchase these pills? Because I'm assuming they're not purchasing fentanyl, right? Is it MDMA? What do they generally think they're purchasing when they're encountering these pills?
Aaron Ford, for the record. I think it varies, to be sure, but there are oftentimes simply trying to buy an opioid, not knowing that that opioid, well, I frankly don't want to name particular opioids on the record, but an opioid that is not fentanyl, I shall say, and that opioid, that pill, is adulterated. Has fentanyl in it, and enough to where it's killing individuals. And so it could be other forms of, I mean, I've heard of that in particular as the type of pill people are trying to purchase. And to the leader's point, we're not talking about the one-off purchase, we're talking about bags full. And so that's what I've heard at this point.
Thank you.
All right, other questions? Senator Wynn.
Hello. I just want to clarify a couple of things because I know that the Attorney General during his presentation indicated that there was some amendments here, and I know that we're trying to meld some of these bills together. So I see in the Office of the Attorney General amendment, it says removing Section 1, subsection 1 from the bill. And I think you had indicated that you were doing that. Were you taking that out because it was included in the majority leader's bill? Or was it the intention to take it out of both bills? Or is that just kind of the melding of the bills?
Aaron Ford, for the record, it's the intent was to remove it from my bill so that it could be addressed in the majority leader's bill.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure. I wasn't sure if you were saying that you were removing it, but then for some other reason, but it was mostly because it was already included in the majority leader's bill. And then I did have an opportunity to look at this, and I have some of the same concerns about the pure fentanyl, not pure fentanyl, and I realized that we don't have it. Do we just not have the capabilities at our labs to distinguish, or does the capability just not exist? I guess that's my first question.
Aaron Ford, for the record, and then I'm going to defer to my Madam Leader. My understanding is that in the state, we don't have the capacity. It's not that it can never be done or cannot be done elsewhere, but in the state, we don't have the capacity to do it, which is the reason why I support this notion of going from, at least studying how we go from qualitative to quantitative. I know, for example, this body created a state lab, I believe last legislative session, and looking for ways to afford it the ability to make those types of determinations could be helpful. But as I understand it, the state labs, the labs in our state right now don't have the capability to do it.
And then I guess my second question, is there ever a possibility that maybe some of the $280 million in opioid settlement funds could be diverted to increase those capabilities if we're trying to move towards a more quantitative, I guess, evidence-based kind of like analysis of that?
Aaron Ford, for the record, that would certainly be my desire and my hope.
I'm spending your money here.
No, it's y'all's money. I bring home the bacon. I put it in your hands, and y'all can determine how it's spent, right? The state itself had to develop a needs assessment to determine how those monies are going to be spent, and DHHS is going to be making those determinations. And so, but not only that, municipalities and counties have to come up with their own needs assessment as well. They may very well determine that they want to use some of that opioid money that my office is bringing in to develop MAP programs in the prisons. They may determine that they want to work toward developing a lab in their jurisdiction that can do quantitative measurements. I would absolutely encourage anyone in this state receiving these tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, to utilize it for these types of purposes, because that's exactly what the purpose is of this money is.
And I appreciate that. I think studying this is something that's incredibly important to figure out how we can get to that, so we don't have people that are lumped in, so we don't have, like a younger person that's at like EDC and is like using Molly, and then all of a sudden is like going to prison for 20 years because it is cut with fentanyl. Or we have a situation like that where something that's, a bad decision turns into something incredibly serious, like, and I understand that you are balancing the dangerousness of fentanyl, so I start with there. And I know you had mentioned, you had showed that clip from Justice Hardesty, talking about how the Sentencing Commission, I know I sat on it once, and I wasn't on it this most recent time, but even during their presentation during interim judiciary, it doesn't appear that they have taken this on. And I don't know if anyone else has taken on some of these things. Even when you look at the legislative history of when these initial numbers of 4 grams to 14 grams to 14 to 28, they weren't based on anything. They were just kind of made up numbers. So I'm wondering if we're just continuing this made up number thing, or if if there's any studies out there existing about what these drug levels and numbers and distinguishing between fentanyl and methamphetamine and heroin, because as you said before, they're arguably not the same.
Thank you for the question, Senator Nicole Canizaro, Senate District 6. So one thing I want to touch on, and then I'll address your second point. I think the other piece about the NYS study, maybe a very smart way to go, is that my understanding is correct, and someone I'm sure will correct me if I've gotten this wrong. There is maybe 1 or 2 labs that are mostly used at the federal level that can do that full analysis to discern exactly what and how much is in whatever substance it is. So it is not something that is done, in every other state except for Nevada, which sometimes we hear about things in this building. This is something that is done in a very, very small circumstance. And so it might be worth it to kind of look at what that might take for a state to adopt something like that, because that is not how most states, or any state really, is using that. It's a very small, it's, I believe, 1 lab, maybe 2, that can accommodate that, and it is a very intensive process. So that was the one thing I wanted to highlight. And then on the piece for how it is that we are differentiating between grams, I think that you are likely correct, right? That we have picked some numbers, and that is where it sort of historically was. And I think for our purposes with this bill, you will find a lot of folks who have dealt with some of the tragedies out of the fentanyl crisis that would argue that it should be much, much lower, just because the lethal dose is very low. I think that certainly that's something to sort of keep in mind, and why we're talking about fentanyl within these particular pieces. With respect to the Sentencing Commission, I also have been a member of that. I don't know that we've had a lot of these discussions, but I think that the point raised with respect to Justice Hardesty is that Assembly Bill 236, while it changed a lot of the trafficking levels, which better conform to when you are dealing with, and certainly I know that you can appreciate this from the criminal justice side as well. When you are dealing with individuals who are the folks who are manufacturing it, distributing it, getting paid from that, trying to get folks to buy their stuff, the 4 grams for something that is a different substance is a small amount, right? And you were seeing that there was capture of folks who were merely addicted. And so that was, I think, smart policy for raising those limits. I think the point made by the Chief Justice that is important for this committee to keep in mind is that he was not arguing that in addressing that in Assembly Bill 236, that should uniformly be the case regardless of substance across the board. And you see that there are, in fact, differentiations, even within Nevada law, even after the passage of Assembly Bill 236. For example, what we would commonly call a date rape drug is not at that same trafficking level, right? Because it's not utilized in the same fashion. It's a much smaller level when it comes to trafficking pieces. And so I think that the point that was sort of delineated with the Chief Justice's remarks is that we can and we should, when it is warranted, take a different look at different substances and how they are treated, and that those substances may need to have a different threshold than some of the changes that were made in Assembly Bill 236. Would be happy to talk about what those thresholds are. The one other point I would make, though, is that 4 grams of fentanyl, as you would currently and most readily find it, is in pill form. That's a lot, even in pill form, to have 4 grams worth. I would argue that if you have that or 14 or 28 grams worth of fentanyl in pill form, you have a lot. That is not something that you're using for personal use or that you've got because you're just going to take it at EDC with some friends. That's a substantial amount, and I think speaks to someone who is manufacturing, delivering, selling that substance.
Senator Dondero Loop.
Yes, I'm asking my school question. So I'm not from this world. So if I don't know, I have a 18-year-old student. They are probably still in high school, maybe, or just graduated, and they take one of these pills and maybe have two more on their person because they're going to share, and they have something go wrong and they get to the hospital and they live. What happens with that person?
Thank you for the question, Senator Nicole Canizaro, Senate District 6. So, first of all, hopefully they make it to the hospital so they can be treated. Something like having 2 additional pills or 3 pills probably does not rise to the level of trafficking, because to get to 4 grams, you have to have quite a few. So that individual may have a possession of a controlled substance charge, maybe. But I think one of the things, and I don't know if this is exactly what you were attempting to address, but one of the pieces that we want to keep in this bill, and so that is a proposed amendment for 343 as well, is to ensure that the Good Samaritan pieces stay in place. So if you are experiencing an overdose, or you're with somebody, you're the teacher or someone who's with them who is seeing somebody experience an overdose, that you can still seek assistance without fear of being prosecuted. And so I think that that piece would speak to that. Possession does fall within the parameters of our current Good Samaritan statute. And so to the extent that that individual that you've mentioned, that student, might have committed another crime, I think they would be covered under the Good Samaritan pieces, to where, we're more concerned about making sure they get that emergency treatment and that they live than trying to prosecute them. And I think that they would fall under that provision.
Okay, thank you. I just, the reason I asked that question, obviously, probably for obvious reasons, but, kids do dumb things, right? And kids get talked into doing dumb things, whatever they may be. And by the way, kids, if somebody's doing something wrong, they might even talk this other kid into helping them do a dumb thing. And the kid thinks, well, it's once, right? I'll carry these pills for my friend, and he can carry half of them, I'll carry half of them, whatever the case may be. And because kids do dumb things, I think what I worry about is putting kids in prison who maybe really aren't bad kids, they just did a dumb thing. And I don't mean that to nullify anything that you're saying or take away from the importance of this, because it scares the crap out of me not only as a community member, but as a mother and a grandmother, right? That these kids can get these pills and die. So that's kind of where I was going with that.
Other questions? Senator Stone.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for your presentations, and I applaud your efforts in trying to address this fentanyl crisis. So you kind of hit me in 3 different areas. So the first area that you've hit me is that I have 2 friends that each had sons. One was from an affluent family, one was from a middle-class family. And their children, on their first attempt of trying what they thought was heroin, expired, which was devastating for those families. I also, when I decided I was going to run for office here in Nevada, I'm 67 years old. I'm not looking to further a political career that started in the state next door. I wanted to be a resource, and I wanted to help make Nevada the best that it can be, because it's my new home. So I consider myself a subject matter expert on this drug. I've got a doctorate in pharmacy. I taught pharmacology at USC School of Pharmacy. I taught pharmacology for graduate nursing students at Cal State Dominguez Hills in California. So I appreciate a lot of what you're trying to do in this legislation, but I'd like to make a few points, and I do have some questions. So U.S. Customs and Border Patrol confiscated last year alone 12,900 pounds of fentanyl, or roughly about 6.5 tons. Now, we've talked about 2 milligrams being a fatal dose. I made it 3 milligrams just to make sure I wasn't fudging the data. If you use 3 milligrams, that means that 6.5 tons would kill 1.95 billion people. Billion with a B. Now, I agree that we're not seeing fentanyl a lot in pure form. We're seeing it cut, right? But we're seeing it cut in such a way that it still has as much fentanyl as necessary to kill somebody. And how does fentanyl kill somebody? What it basically does is it shuts off your sensors that tell you to breathe, senses your carbon dioxide levels in your blood, puts those to sleep, and you end up basically suffocating to death. More than 150 people die every single day from some form of opiate overdose. I would opine that many of it's probably fentanyl in some way, and over 70,000 documented fentanyl overdoses in the past year. And just so you have some clarity about the ranges that you have, 4 grams of fentanyl is basically 4/5 of a teaspoonful, almost a teaspoonful. That alone, if you figure 3 milligrams is fatal, would kill 1,333 people. Now, one thing that I like that Senator Canizaro, our majority leader, did is she also put analogs of, I applaud you for that, congeners as we call them. So carfentanil, which we're seeing some traces of, by the way, is 10,000 times more potent than morphine and 100 times more potent than fentanyl. So if you use 4 grams of carfentanil, it would not kill 1,333, it would kill 133,000 people. And then if you go to your upper range of 14 grams, that kills 4,666 people, or carfentanil 466,000. And then 27 grams, which is less than the 28 grams, right? That's 9,000 and 900,000 respectively. And then the high level, let's just assume 100 grams. 100 grams is 3.5 ounces. It's not that much, right? But if you cut it where it's 3 milligrams in a tablet or it's 3 milligrams in a powder, it kills 333,000 people. So you're right, Mr. Attorney General. We're talking about a very dangerous drug that in very small amounts kills people. I say it's a drug that doesn't have any second chances. In 2016, the DEA National Drug Threat Assessment said that clandestine fentanyl is distributed in the United States in the same manner that heroin is. It's sold in powder form in glassine bags or envelopes after being stamped with a brand name. It's often sold as heroin with many users not aware of the presence of fentanyl in the substance. So the bottom line is it's killing a lot of people. So as I mentioned, I wanted to be a contributor here. So I had a bill, and I'm not pushing my bill. I don't think it's going to get heard, which is fine. It's SB 170. But where my bill was different than your bills. And I agree with you. I don't want to go after the end user. But I do want to go after the purveyor. I want to go after the guy that's selling it as fentanyl, just like you do. And I applaud you for wanting to do that. But my bill took it a step further, Mr. Attorney General, that if you sold what you had as something other than fentanyl, and you knew that fentanyl was in it, it deserves a large enhancement if you hurt somebody. And thirdly, if you sell something as something else other than fentanyl, and you kill somebody, it should have a very high penalty. So these considerations are something that I think you should take into consideration. And I would love to work with you on this if there's other work that you feel that needs to be done on this, and I think that it does. You see the quantities that you have, which is low level, mid level, which can kill literally thousands of people. We're playing with fire here. So, and we're not comparing apples to oranges when you look at other Schedule I or other Schedule II drugs. Somebody asks, what are these being sold as? Well, they're being sold as OxyContin. They're being sold as Percodan. They're being sold as Percocet, right? But unbeknownst to the user that's getting them, they're taking them. They might take 2 of them. So they might be getting 6 milligrams of fentanyl. And if they don't have any Narcan and they're not lucky enough to be around you to get it, they're going to be dead. They're going to be dead. So I think you guys have made a really good attempt at trying to solve this problem, but if you don't go after the people that are selling the fentanyl, that are selling it as something else, and that are using it to lace other drugs, I think we're still going to see a significant amount of morbidity and unfortunately mortality, especially with young people that just don't understand how dangerous of a drug this really is. So I guess my question is, would you consider looking at crimes where you have, it's really at the top, it's not the middleman, it's the guy at the top that's selling it to all these distributors, if you will. He's selling it either as pure fentanyl, he's selling it as laced fentanyl, or he's selling it as something else. That's the guy or gal, that's the one that I think you really should be focusing your efforts on. And those are the ones that should get inordinately high penalties if you really want to stop this activity from happening in Nevada. I would like to hear how you feel about incorporating some language like that into your bill or bills.
Thank you, Senator Stone, for your question. A couple of responses. I will reiterate what I said at the beginning of my testimony in referencing snowfall. I'm trying to get Franklin Saint, who is doing exactly what you're talking about, right? I'm trying to get Teddy McDonald, who was a CIA agent buying the coke that was ultimately being converted into crack. I'm not trying to get Wanda. That's what I've mentioned. So to some extent, we are endeavoring to reach those that you've already detailed. The second thing I'll mention is what I've already indicated as well is in my legislation class, they taught me I don't have to deal with every ill in one bill. I would respectfully request that this bill address this issue, and others can address the issue that you've brought up, because there's probably a lot more intricacy and detail associated with that conversation than is aware to me at this point. So I would respectfully decline that request at this juncture and suggest that, again, other bills take up that particular social ill. But I understand what you're saying, and you've mentioned particular drugs that are laced with fentanyl, that are sold or portrayed as being other types of opioids. I didn't want to mention those. You have, and I will leave it to the record for that purpose. And that's what's happening out there. Madam Dondero Loop, I have a high school teenage son right now. He's my last one in high school, and he's lost friends. And it scares me half to death that in fact, people trying to buy a Percocet are buying something laced with fentanyl, and they are dying. And that's predominantly the reason why I do have the fentanyl in my truck, because I take my son to and from here and there, and I have no idea what we're going to encounter. And so, again, this is an issue that's very serious, one that we want to address. And look, hopefully my reputation speaks for itself when it comes to trying to balance criminal justice and reform. I'm trying to walk a line here and ensure that we can accomplish some very important stuff. And I've asked for support and assistance on trying to walk this line as tightly as possible. And anyone that has suggestions on ways to address this, please come forward. But I want it to be germane, obviously, to what we're working on right now, as opposed to something else. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. I'll just follow up with just one comment, and that is that Ross Perot once said that there's nothing wrong with stealing a good idea from somebody else. I'm not looking for any credit here. I'm not looking for any credit. I just want to be a contributor to solve a problem, because I don't want your son being the next victim. I don't want my granddaughter being the next victim. And I think if you don't proactively go after the ones that are at the top that are manufacturing and tainting and distributing, I think we're still going to see the morbidity and mortality. I just hope that both of you might look at SB 170. Take it. I'm at the point in my life, I don't need credit for things. I just want to be a contributor to reduce the morbidity and mortality of innocent people that are trying these drugs for the first time and not getting a second chance, and they're dying, and their parents have got to bury their kids. So I appreciate your efforts, and thank you for your consideration.
Other questions from members of the committee? Senator Orenshaw.
Majority Leader General Ford, thank you for the bill. I appreciate everything you're trying to do here. One question I have, General, and maybe to go with your fact pattern, if these bills pass into law and inadvertently, unintentionally, Wanda is caught and prosecuted, and she's not the salesperson, she's not the manufacturer, she's not the distributor. Do you think there's any flexibility either in these bills or an existing statute for Wanda to get a chance at treatment rather than prison and maybe have deferred judgment? I think that's kind of my worry. I appreciate the intent, but I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, or there might be any wiggle room on that.
Thank you so much, Senator. I'm going to actually phone a friend after I finish my comment and ask the Senator to chime in as well here. This bill doesn't supplant diversion courts, for example. This doesn't supplant other alternatives and assistance that people can receive. But I have thought about what happens if Wanda gets caught in here. I told you the Wanda who was cooking the crack, the cocaine and making the crack, she's supposed to get caught. The Wanda who later in the series was the crack addict. We would hope if she gets arrested, she gets medicated assisted treatment. Right. That's one of the reasons why we're contemplating including that in this bill, so that those who are caught into the system may be able to receive some level of assistance. They may have to serve some jail time or prison time as it may be, because there will be some overlap. There will be some people who are the addicts and the dealers, right? And so, I would anticipate the other alternatives out there to incarceration, whether they be diversion courts and drug treatment programs and things of that sort, would still be available. I'm not endeavoring to undo those. So hopefully that responds to some level to your question. And again, I'll defer, phone a friend to see if my leader has anything further to say.
Thank you, Attorney General Ford, and thank you, Senator Orenshaw, for the question. Nicole Cannizzaro, Senate District 6. So I think the first piece of this is that I do believe that based on some of the levels here and how we're currently seeing it, it would be a rare circumstance where someone like Wanda may be encaptured in the provisions of these two bills. So I will start there. Number one. Number two is that I do think that, especially with the addition of the MAT treatment that the Attorney General spoke of, right, to allow for some of that treatment to occur as well, if somebody were to find themselves incarcerated, I think is an important piece of this to address it from an addiction standpoint. The third piece is that there's nothing about this bill that would necessarily negate any plea negotiations that may occur. That oftentimes, even prior to Assembly Bill 236, individuals who were arrested for trafficking, especially if it were lower amounts, which might indicate someone, especially for some of the things that we've changed with 236, would have indicated, an addiction issue, or there were facts and circumstances surrounding that, would definitely receive a different plea or a different treatment, right? This doesn't negate any of that, and certainly wouldn't negate the ability for individuals to seek treatment. I don't think that is encompassed by this bill, but I think the most important piece is really that first step, which is to have that 4 grams, especially if you're talking about in pill form, is quite a lot to reach that. And so I think somebody who is maybe in the circumstance you've described would be certainly, I don't think you can address every particular issue, right? And that's how come we have things like plea negotiations, to address specific circumstances, even where activity may meet the elements of a particular crime. But I do think that when you're crafting legislation, you have to craft the law in a way that does get at the issue and still allow for some of that leniency where it is appropriate. And I do think that would be covered under current law and under these bills.
Thank you, Majority Leader. Thank you, General.
Okay, I think I have the last question, because I also appreciate the intent here not to get at the end user, but to get at somebody who's trafficking in fentanyl or substances that include significant amounts of fentanyl. So why even include the person in constructive possession of fentanyl in this bill?
Thank you for the question, Senator Nicole Cannizzaro, Senate District 6. Constructive possession can be something that it is just not on your person. And so certainly when you talk about constructive possession, it's not that in particular is going to make a delineation between somebody who may have an addiction issue and be in possession of, or someone who is trafficking and be in possession of. possession, and possession, I will say, in a number of statutes. If you're in possession of a stolen vehicle, if you're in possession of an unauthorized firearm, if you are in possession of stolen property, possession is commonly, typically, and always, actual or constructive possession. Possession sort of encompasses both formats. And so if somebody merely has, within maybe their vehicle, this particular substance, that could be constructive possession. We want to include that because that doesn't necessarily, I don't think that really goes one way or the other, right? If just not having it in your pocket would avail you of having any sort of would make sure that we couldn't get at those drug traffickers, then I think that's what we would see, right? If you have an apartment where you are manufacturing, pills that are laced with fentanyl, and that apartment, is searched, and you are ultimately, brought up on charges for that, potentially under this bill, that constructive possession piece, I think is just exists because that is how the law is currently and commonly structured when it relates to possession.
So to follow up, in that example, if you do have someone who's manufacturing substances in an apartment, then they would fall under the manufacturing portion in line 5. So maybe the better question is, why include possession at all, and why not just limit it to people who are manufacturing, delivering, selling, or bringing into the state?
Thank you for the question, Senator Nicole Cannizzaro, Senate District 6. So I think one of the hard parts about this is, and why we're talking about it in a trafficking context, is that in order to say, charge somebody with possession with intent to sell. Possession with intent to sell in NRS 453-337 is a Category D felony. It is a 1 to 4. It includes any variety of illicit substances that someone may be selling. You have to have evidence, certainly, of someone who is actively with the substance, who has given it in exchange for something of value, generally money. Usually those charges come because someone also has with them maybe a scale, maybe an O sheet, maybe other paraphernalia that indicates that they're packaging something for sale. If you're manufacturing, you would have to find some sort of lab or other facility that shows how they are putting them together into a pill form. Most often, what you're going to have is someone who is doing those things but has a bunch of them with them. Maybe they don't have an O sheet, but they're still selling those pills. And that's why when you're talking about it from a drug trafficking standpoint, certainly those other statutes may still apply, right? If somebody is possession with intent to sell, or somebody is engaging in the manufacturing piece. But when somebody has a large quantity in possession, that is not somebody who has it for personal use. And I would again submit that I think when you're looking at the levels that are included in these bills, those are large quantities. So this is not somebody who has it for personal use, largely. And so that's why the possession, much like any other trafficking statute, does include the possession piece, but because we're talking about larger quantities, it's not somebody who falls within the category of folks who may be charged with just possession of a controlled substance. And I think that's the intent of these statutes, is to sort of encompass that, the sale, the manufacture, and people who are walking around trying to sell those outside of that context.
All right, thank you. I don't see any further questions, so we will move on to testimony in support of SB 35 and SB 343 as they work together with the conceptual amendments presented to us today. Anybody wishing to give testimony in support is invited to the table in Las Vegas or Carson City right now. Looks like we have people coming up to testify in both places, so we will start in Carson City. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Mike Cathcart, representing the City of Henderson. First, I want to thank the Attorney General and the Majority Leader for bringing the bills. Fentanyl is an issue that is impacting all parts of Clark County, including Henderson. For the record, Mike Cathcart, representing the City of Henderson. The tools included in these bills will be very beneficial to law enforcement to go after the producers and the traffickers of fentanyl. We believe that these bills attempt to strike the right balance in going after those responsible for illicit fentanyl being accessible in our community and that those not suffering from addiction. I also want to thank the Attorney General for being willing to work with us a little bit on the amendment. And with that, I'll take any questions.
I don't see any questions, so thank you. And we will go down to Las Vegas for a testimony in support. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Susan Prophet, and I'm the Vice President of the Nevada Republican Club. I do thank you for bringing this bill, Ms. Kanazawa and Mr. Ford. However, I don't think it goes far enough. All right, and Senator Stone, thank you so much for mentioning SB 170. I really think that it would do wonders for our community if we saw some bipartisanship that is working together, whether you get credit or not. So please, would you all please consider what an expert has in his bill. And I appreciate you for doing this, but it doesn't go far enough. Letting a murderer out after 10 years is pretty much a slap in the face for me. I've lost my daughter to fentanyl. And another thing, I would really appreciate it if you would stop calling it overdoses. This is not overdose, it's murder. It is brought in from China deliberately to murder us from within. It is destroying our communities and our families, and it's being muled over the gate, the open border. And so if we don't stop the flow and stop the people who are producing it, like China and the cartel who is trafficking it, then all of this bill is for naught. We've got to stop the flow, or we're never going to stop this madness. And I really do think you should pass this bill, but it needs to be amended and a few more things added. By the way, another thing that we need to fix in order for this to work is to get enough police officers on the streets that can respond, because my daughter, I found the guy who sold it to her, who brought it to her, and yet when I called the investigators, they didn't have time to go after him because they said there were too many bodies in the morgue and not enough police officers to process them. This was in Jacksonville, Florida, 2 years ago on Father's Day, and you must do more. Thank you for this. This is really starting the ball rolling, but please do more.
Thank you for your testimony. I'm looking for anybody else in support in Carson City or Las Vegas. Not seeing anybody, we will go to the phone for testimony in support of SB 35 and SB 343.
Thank you, Chair. If you would like to offer testimony in support of SB 35 and 343, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Thank you, Chair. There are no callers wishing to offer testimony in support at this time.
All right, we will go to testimony in opposition, starting with those in person in Carson City. Those in opposition in Las Vegas are also invited to come up to the table and start queuing up.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Erica Roth, ERICAROTH, on behalf of the Washoe County Public Defender's Office. I did submit a letter that was drafted last night on Nellis. I hope that all of you have had a chance to review it, and I'm not going to rehash all of those arguments that I made, but I do stand by the sentiment of that letter. Fentanyl is deadly, but the evidence is undisputed that so are these bills. Experts across the political spectrum have made clear that increasing criminal penalties for drug possession not only destroys communities through mass incarceration, but it also increases overdose deaths. These bills will kill. Even the report issued by this state planning how to address opioid abuse and overdose did not recommend increasing criminal penalties. We understand the desire to go after drug traffickers. However, These bills do not amend the current drug trafficking statutes. That was mentioned today. NRS 453.3317, those are in regards to sales. This will criminalize someone in mere possession of any amount of fentanyl. And this is problematic for many reasons. But if we're looking at 4 grams, we have 4 grams of sugar here. And if 3 of those grams is cocaine and 1 of those grams is fentanyl, the person in possession of this will now be a drug trafficker. And whether or not that is the intent of the bill, that is the reality that will be born from this bill. So I understand the desire to do something, but we must not return to the draconian penalties of the 1980s and 1990s. And I'll close with this, which I did provide in my letter. Increasing penalties for possession of fentanyl is yet another iteration of the drug war's ineffective and punitive strategies. To prevent overdoses and protect our communities, this body must invest in public health solutions to mitigate the harms of illicit fentanyl. We know how to combat this issue, and it is not by increasing penalties for crime. The science and research makes clear we can invest in our communities, we can invest in treatment, we can fund Narcan for all. I too keep Narcan in my car, and I do not want the risk of overdose to increase as it will under these bills. We appreciate greatly the conversations that we have had with the bill sponsors. I know we will continue to have more conversations, and that is greatly appreciated. But as we stand today, we must oppose this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. John Piro from the Clark County Public Defender's Office. No healthy treatment plan can be born from a bad diagnosis. These bills are an aggressive and inferior solution to a complex problem. They are recycling an almost 40-year-old failed solution to an ever-evolving problem and ask this body to repeat the same failed policies. We keep talking about fictional TV characters. There are real-life people that will testify on the phone that are affected by these bills. Language matters. It's not the intent to go after the user, but when you reduce it back down to 4 grams and you take away everything that we did in AB 236, which is what this bill does because everything is cut with fentanyl, language matters. And when the courts are looking at this, they're not going to look at the intent. They're going to go after the users, which is what these bills do. And to say that we don't have the tools and this is closing a loophole in the tools, that's not accurate either. We have a DA in the room, Mark Jackson, who just prosecuted a woman for fentanyl trafficking. He got a sentence of 12 to 32 years. We have the necessary tools to do what we need to do. And there's no loopholes that need to be closed because our standard drug laws would apply. Rand did a study, 600 pages. The state did an opioid study, 180 pages. None of these solutions were proposed in those studies. Nothing from the Sentencing Commission came out with these regressive type policies. The Surge Committee, of which A.G. Ford talked about, this was the only non-unanimous resolution to come out of that committee, meaning nobody agreed that this was the right way to attack this problem. If we want to capture the right people and not all people, then we need not move forward with this bill. New solutions need to come to the table. This is a very old solution, and we've lost this war this way. What we will do is throw away a whole generation of Nevadans again. That's what this bill will do. That's what the language in these bills will do. It may not be the intent, but that's what the language says. We're on the ground day to day. We see this every day. We don't like what fentanyl is doing to our community either, but this is not the solution.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Attar Hasibullah, first name spelled A-T-H-A-R, last name spelled H-A-S-E-E-B-U-L-L-A-H. I'm the Executive Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Nevada. We appreciate the intent of both the Attorney General and the Majority Leader and their willingness to collaborate with stakeholders, but the ACLU of Nevada is firmly opposed to both Senate Bill 35 and Senate Bill 343. This bill in hearing is actually reminiscent of the late 80s. This bill neither of the bills call for the removal the FDA removal or approval of fentanyl. The bill doesn't go after suppliers. These bills don't target kingpins. The bills don't target cartels. The bills don't even target the sale of fentanyl, only possession. Whether intended or not, this bill goes after a user who unknowingly received drugs laced with fentanyl. And more likely, these bills will target people with addiction, and they'll be used to pad arrest and conviction statistics statewide to pretend like we're actually addressing an issue that we are not addressing. Nevadans will end up paying tens of millions and potentially hundreds of $millions into a criminal legal system to prosecute and incarcerate those experiencing addiction. And make no mistake, the spread of fentanyl will not stop or decrease because of these bills. Nevada will be no safer as a result of them. Let's put it into perspective. Percocet's often cut with fentanyl. A 5 milligram Percocet pill weighs approximately 550 milligrams. So 4 grams here would be about 7 pills, and 14 grams would be about 25 pills. Ask yourself the following question. How many cartels cutting drugs like Percocet with fentanyl do you think care about this bill? And does anyone on this committee or in this room actually think that a cartel or a drug ring is going to stop production of drugs laced with fentanyl because of these bills? Moreover, which cartel or distributor stakes their claim on such a small quantity of pills? These bills won't save lives, but they're almost certain to destroy communities. Today and always, we don't need you to be acting like you're tough on crime. We need you to be smart in addressing solutions that relate to public health. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. My name is Nick Shepak, S-H-E-P-A-C-K. I am the State Deputy Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. I also help to organize a statewide coalition referred to as the Justice Reform and Accountability Alliance. On behalf of that coalition, I've been sitting in on these meetings, and I want to thank the Attorney General and the Senator for having us at those meetings. But we had one single request in every meeting through all the meetings, and that's to provide any data that suggests that this type of law will reduce overdoses from any other state, from any other situation, and we have yet to receive data that suggests this. What we have found through organizations such as the RAND Corporation, Drug Policy Alliance, people from every side of the aisle, is detailed recommendations on how to deal with these issues. They specifically say to not do this, and they have detailed evidence-based solutions, and we need to continue our march towards evidence-based reforms in this committee and in this body. And quickly, 2 very personal things that have happened to me. A friend of mine had received Percocet, what they thought was Percocet years ago, before we knew this. It was laced with fentanyl. Luckily, they survived. It was a scary situation, but 10 of those pills, less than 10 of those pills would have put them in the trafficking level. That is not a large amount of drugs to buy. And the second is I have administered Narcan to a stranger at a gas station by the house where I live. I was there buying Band-Aids, and I heard somebody yelling, "We need Narcan, we need Narcan." I carry it. I lived close enough. I sprinted home, got it back. They wouldn't call the police because they were scared of the drug-induced homicide laws. They were scared of the possession laws that were already on the books. I ended up calling the police, administering the Narcan while they left the scene. If we increase these penalties in this direction, we are going to discourage even that behavior. We're going to discourage calling for help when it is needed, and we are going to see more lives be lost. And so I caution you against moving forward with this as written. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battleborn Progress. We stand today in opposition of SB 35 and SB 343 as written. While we commend the efforts to quell the outbreak of fentanyl deaths, we believe this bill will have unintended consequences. Quote, "The casual user cannot morally escape responsibility for the action of drug traffickers and dealings. I'm saying that if you're a casual drug user, you're an accomplice to murder. The casual user also cannot morally escape the association with those who use drugs and then endanger the public safety. The message from casual use is that drugs are acceptable, that they can be handled, and somehow it's simply a matter of dosage. Casual use sets the tone for tolerance, and that tolerance has killed." Those are the words of former President Ronald Reagan. Another excerpt from The War on Drugs is 50 years old, published in The Nation in July 2021. Quote, In June 1986, just a day after signing a multi-million-dollar contract with the NBA's Boston Celtics, college basketball sensation Len Bias collapsed in his dorm at the University of Maryland from a fatal cocaine overdose. 5 months later, President Ronald Reagan would sign an Anti-Drug Abuse Act, aka the Len Bias Law, and it would lead to a quantum expansion of the domestic drug war, including a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years just for the possession of 5 grams of cocaine. These policies didn't work in 1986, and they will not work now. Mandatory minimum sentences for simple drug possession or trafficking, as seen in this bill, are reminiscent of the failed war on drugs. They are not proven to deter crime while also increasing the likelihood of recidivism. I know the sponsors do not think this is the same as the war on drugs. However, the words heard today in these bills are eerily similar. This is going backwards from the good work we have done the past several sessions. Even the fear and stigma created by these enhanced penalties can lead to communities having a fear and distrust of law enforcement that further erodes public safety and trust. As a niece of an uncle who sits in prison currently after fighting in Vietnam because he had a drug addiction, this is personal for me. Preventing overdose deaths and treating addiction are matters of public health, not prisons. Lawmakers should follow the guidance of public health experts on this issue, rather than pushing for further incarceration for people who probably do not even know they possess these drugs. This bill will, in fact, kill. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Scheibel, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. My name is John Jones, and I'm here on behalf of the Nevada District Attorneys Association. I want to first start off by giving the apologies for District Attorney Association President Mark Jackson. He had intended to be here but had to step out for another appointment. And I want to say that we appreciate Attorney General Ford and Majority Leader Cannizzaro for recognizing the proliferation that fentanyl derivatives has had on the greatest public health and safety issues facing our state. We appreciate the opportunity to be part of a stakeholder group that has met during the session to discuss bill language related to this epidemic. Our opposition is based on the mandated medication assistant treatment program and the proposed in SB 35, as well as the proposed Good Samaritan provision, but we have not yet seen that amendment. I also like to address sort of what we're seeing on the ground in terms of pill size. I know we've had a lot of numbers thrown out at you. What we see most of the time with respect to fentanyl is what we are calling the blue M30 pill. And each of those pills weigh about 100 milligrams each, meaning that there are 10 pills in each packet, and 40 pills would constitute trafficking under the proposal before you today. I'll note that we do not see a lot of simple users possessing that many pills. And to illustrate one of the current problems with the law is right now 14 grams is considered possession of controlled substance under Nevada law, which is our lowest level of drug offense in this state. So that would mean using the fake M30 pill, again, the pill that we see the most as a basis, you could have 140 pills and still be considered possession of controlled substance, which includes mandatory dismissal and mandatory diversion. But again, users don't possess that many pills. So that's one of the reasons why this legislation is essential, and we do look forward to working with Majority Leader Cannizzaro and Attorney General Ford on this bill. Thank you, Chair.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. Jason Walker, Jasonwalker, testifying in very soft opposition on behalf of the Washington County Sheriff's Office, mainly for the requirement of the MAT program. Fortunately for us as the Washington County Sheriff's Office, we have a successful MAT program. I believe it would be difficult for smaller agencies to put a MAT program together, even if they're able to do that. It took us several years to put one together. We were talking about stats. I gathered some Washoe County stats. In 2021, fentanyl deaths from the Washoe County Medical Examiner's Office was 79. In 2022 was 138. That's a 75% increase. And out of those numbers from 2022, it's a near equal split between male and female. 101 female overdose deaths, 203 male. Age range, 18 to 24 years of age, 42%. 25 to 34 year of age, 53%. And again, with DA Jones, he's correct. We do find the fake M30 pills out there. One thing that I gathered from the conversation already is that we can all agree that we have a major public safety problem and we have a major public health problem. I believe on both sides of the table we are smart enough to figure something out. I look forward to continued conversations to better our position.
And Mr. Walker, if you could hang on, I think we have a question for you from Senator Wynn.
Thank you. I have a question. I appreciate your, I guess, soft opposition and that you already have a MAP program. I guess my concern is if we look at these studies, and I did have the opportunity to read the December 2022 study from the Department of Health and Human Services here that was in response to the opioid epidemic. And almost all of that information, and I did not have the opportunity to read the 600-page RAND Corporation report, but even in that, with my cursory search, these medically aided treatment programs are one of the only things that is recommended. You're doing it obviously in your jails, so is there any reason why we wouldn't be able to replicate some version of this in other places? If our true intent is to help get people real treatment and save lives.
I believe we can replicate it in other jurisdictions and smaller agencies. Time, effort, money, you referenced the money coming in, $280 million or something like that. And again, it took us 3 years to put our MAT program together. There's doctors involved, there's clinicians that you have to, there's all of that. And you said it's a 600-page report. I haven't read it either. To answer your question, it can be done.
I read the 180-page one.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Jody Hocking, JODIHOCKING. I'm the founder and director of Return Strong. We're an organization that works with currently incarcerated people, their families. I'd like to quickly start, and I feel like I might have told this story before, but my husband was born in prison. He was born addicted to heroin and crack. His mother was addicted to those and was in prison when he was born. Never in the existence of that family has anyone ever worked at or had the opportunity to address the root of the problem, which was their addiction. There will always be somebody selling a drug somewhere. The only way to really stop that, and this is what he says, the only way to stop that is to deal with the drug addiction and the underlying issues that are there. So I always say, like, even with our work with Return, I can't take my glasses off. Are we fighting the tip of the iceberg, or are we fighting the root of the problem? Sometimes you have to do both, but I wanted to kind of respond to Attorney General Ford about Wanda. Right now, my husband's family, if you went to Washoe County Jail, Jermaine, Latrine, William, and Nicole are all sitting in Washoe County Jail, that they could very easily be caught under this. They're not traffickers. They have addiction issues. And that family is overwhelmed. And they're not the only one. I deal with thousands of families like that that are inside Nevada prisons right now. My fear with this is it's not going to solve the problem. For the past 20 years, we've been dismantling 50 years of failed policy from the war on drugs and its effect on Black, brown, and poor people in America. Every day we get letters from people who've spent decades in prison in a failed attempt to stop drug epidemics. It doesn't matter what the drug is. Increasing the trafficking weight thresholds hasn't worked to stop deaths in the past, and it won't work now. We can't, as a society, keep going back to the same solutions that didn't work before, anticipating that they'll work. Isn't that what they say, that saying about it's a definition of insanity? If we rip this out at the root and we address people's need for substances and need for drugs to relieve their pain and trauma, we eliminate the opportunity for other people, the bad players, to profit off of them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Scheibel and the Senate Committee on Judiciary. My name is Chris Reese, it's R-I-E-S, and I represent the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Due to the rules of the committee, we were opposed to this combined bill. I want to thank both the Majority Leader and the Attorney General and their dedicated respective staffs for their effort on this. We do believe lowering the threshold for trafficking of fentanyl and its derivatives will have an important and meaningful effect on decreasing the increasing amount of deaths that we are seeing. I echo some of the concerns in the testimony from the Nevada District Attorneys Association. We have concerns still with some of the language of the SB 35 portion of the bill. However, we are looking forward to continuing the work with Majority Leader Canizaro as well as Attorney General Ford to alleviate these, and hopefully we will move to a position of support. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Scheibel and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Pamela Del Porto, Pamela Delporto. For the record, I am Executive Director for Nevada Sheriffs and Chiefs. I'm here today in conjunction with the committee rules. I'm here to testify in opposition to Senate Bill 35 due to the concerns on behalf of the rural, city, and county detention centers and jails. We appreciate the efforts to control the horrific incidents involving fentanyl by both bills and their sponsors, and I look forward to continued conversations as we work towards a position of support. I apologize, I'm out of breath. I had to run from government affairs. Thank you.
That's okay. I am being paged to government affairs right now, so I am going to leave you all in Senator Orenshaw's very capable hands, and I think I'll be back.
Thank you very much, Chair. Opposition to Senate Bill 35, if there's anyone else here in Carson City. If not, I see someone down at the Sawyer Building. Please state your name for the record and proceed, and I believe we are at 2 minutes per witness.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Sean O'Donnell. I'm the Executive Director of Foundation for Recovery, statewide organization operated by people and families recovering from substance use and co-occurring disorders, the very constituents this bill targets. In January of this year, I celebrated 6 years of recovery, and every year our organization witnesses and celebrates similar milestones for hundreds of your constituents. There is no doubt that we all want to prevent fentanyl in our communities and go after the bad guys who are trafficking copious amounts of addicting and lethal substances in our state. Whether it's the intent or not, both of these bills will seriously harm Nevadans battling their addiction and rip apart families by imposing stricter criminal penalties without any hard data or science to support this method of mitigation. The bill does not address the bad guys. It wrongly targets people struggling with behavioral health conditions, not the true drug traffickers we all want off of our streets. The mandatory sentences and penalties are one thing, but what I really want lawmakers to understand is that following incarceration of these patients and people with behavioral health disorders, they end up at the doorstep of our organization and other nonprofits. The long-term effects of these felony charges makes it exponentially harder for our recovery team to find housing and employment for people with felony charges. And what happens when someone can't find a place to live or work following incarceration? Oftentimes a cycle of drug use and finding other means to financially support oneself and our families starts over. What we know is that mandatory minimums targeting specific substances, like what we heard about crack cocaine in the past, and creating barriers for people to call 911 in the event of an overdose, not only doesn't work, but it kills. Families, people recovering from substance use disorders, and public health experts agree that this is regressive policy and will not address our ability to curb opioid deaths or deter fentanyl in our drug supply in our state of Nevada. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Anyone else at the Sawyer Building who wishes to speak in opposition? All right, not seeing anyone. Broadcasting, is there anyone on the phone lines who wishes to speak in opposition to either Senate Bill 35 or Senate Bill 343?
Thank you. If you would like to speak in opposition to SB 35 or 343, please press star 9 to take your place in the queue.
Don't know.
Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Caller with the last three digits, 279. You are unmuted and may proceed.
Hello, sorry about that. It got cut off a little bit. Good afternoon. My name is Laura Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, here in opposition to Senate Bill 35 and 343. Since 2011, 45 states have proposed legislation to increase penalties for fentanyl, while 39 states have passed or enacted legislation, the same type of legislation. We have yet to see a reduction in fentanyl use with these changes in policy. We know that the war on drugs disproportionately harms low-income and minority communities. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are Black or Latino. Harsh penalties for fentanyl only continue to perpetuate the discriminatory war on drugs. Instead of offering proven public health policy solutions that save lives, our politicians want to lock up our loved ones and let drug corporations flood our communities with addictive painkillers for profit, while working with corporate lobbyists to deny us treatments that we need. What we need is a public health response to drug and overdose issues. And I know we were talking about television characters during this testimony, but one name I will leave you with is Ian, and that is my brother, who on July 17th, 2001 overdosed. He needed public health and services. He did not need to be criminalized for his addiction. Thank you, and again, opposition, Senate Bill 35 and 343.
Thank you very much. And broadcasting, before we go to the next caller, I just want to let everybody know at the Sawyer Building, it seems like we've lost our feed to the Sawyer Building. So if anyone is at the Sawyer Building in Las Vegas and would like to call in, either now in the opposition, or we're still going to take neutral testimony, or later on in public comment, the number you dial is 888-475-4499. Again, that phone number is 888-475-4499. The meeting ID is 82033-272876. Again, that's meeting ID 82033-272876. And that phone number, the meeting ID, is on the agenda, which should be in the room at the Sawyer Building, if you want to call in to testify or to make public comment. Broadcasting, if you can go back to the phone lines in opposition.
Thank you, Senator Orenthal. Caller with the last three digits, 755. You are unmuted and may proceed.
Members of the committee, my name is Ryan Hampton, Hampton. I'm the Executive Director of the Recovery Advocacy Project. We're a statewide recovery advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring the voices of people in recovery and family members are represented in Carson City. I am also a person in long-term recovery from opioid addiction. I have testified on this very issue in Congress for years now, and have worked with Republicans and Democrats and the White House alike on ensuring we employ public safety measures that offer support to people who need help, not jail. I'm the survivor of many near-fatal overdoses. My story as a person in recovery is not because the system works. It's not because the public health measures we have in place catch those most vulnerable to an overdose. And it is certainly not because our drug policy prioritizes public health over the failed tactics still finding their way into committee rooms, such as SB 343. And I want to thank the Attorney General for his amendment to Section 1, Subsection 1, and to reference your snowfall comparison, sir, SB 343 still 100% goes after Wanda, the quote-unquote crack addict, since Section 1, Subsection 1 is still included. Let me make myself clear. SB 343 is a very bad, harmful bill because of this. While I'm in solid agreement with every member of the legislature that something has got to be done about fentanyl, this bill is a misguided attempt that ignores basic principles learned from decades of data and ignores the lessons from the past during the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s. Section 1, Subsection 1 provides a threshold so low for a 1-year minimum mandatory and a felony at 4 grams that it will undoubtedly imprison people who use drugs and people who need help. Let me further explain. 1 gram of fentanyl can currently be purchased in San Francisco for as little as $10. Essentially $40 of fentanyl, which is a personal use amount, will land someone a 1-year minimum mandatory and a felony that will prevent them from getting a job or finding housing. This is why people with addiction who are incarcerated are over 120 times more likely to overdose and die. Contrary to the majority leader's
And sir, we are at 2 minutes. Sir, we're at 2 minutes, so if you could just wrap it up and close.
Absolutely. I urge you to please vote no on SB 343, and we remain neutral on SB 335 with the current amendments proposed by the Attorney General, and hope to work with his office on more amendments. Thank you.
Broadcasting, is there anyone else in
Hello,
opposition?
my name is
Please state your name for the record and
Yes.
proceed.
My name is Yesenia Moya, Yesenia. I am an impacted community member. 2 friends of mine have passed away because of their drug addiction, despite getting quote-unquote help as the state gives it out right now. She went to a treatment center, and a week later she died. I have used my Narcan more times than I can count, and my friends and community will be caught up in these bills. They are not the ones that are bringing this into the state. I will lose more of my community because of your lack of care and need to push bipartisan fixes. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The intent of these bills will not negate the absolute harmful impact that they will have on my community. Fentanyl ODs are not on purpose. Everything is laced with it. Cocaine, crack, meth, weed, pills, ecstasy, and the lead goes on. You want the deaths to be curbed? You want ODs to stop? Create access to drug treatment programs. Create wraparound programs for our folks that are free and worthwhile. Invest in harm reduction and healthcare providers who believe in community care. Train our doctors and healthcare professionals to help our communities. I understand that this bill is performative and pure political posturing because there are actual facts. Why would the Attorney General use a fictional show as an example? I can give you names and dates of the people in my life affected by addiction. A person who is at the place to take a fake opioid is because they have no options left to them other than heroin. This bill is clearly written by folks who have never understood addiction or been affected by it. The AG themselves said the state doesn't have the capabilities to do the testing. He wants to go after Franklin Saint, the black kid who was trying to get out of the hood, but not Teddy, the FBI agent who was the one selling the drugs with permission from the U.S. government. We currently have a woman who led the police association in San Jose who has been smuggling drugs for years. The AG said holistically. How is criminalizing people holistic? How is putting people in a prison cell helpful? It isn't. Don't pass this bill so that jailers and prosecutors can fill their quotas. I would like to ask who is impacted in this working group. Why is the AG talking about a fictional show when this happened to our uncles, aunties, mothers?
Ms. Moya, we're at 2 minutes. Ms. Moya, we're at 2 minutes. Thank you for your testimony.
Why not prosecute the government agents and ICCBP? The road to hell
Ms.
is
Moya,
filled
I
with
do need to wrap it up. We're past 2 minutes now. Thank you for your testimony.
This bill is harmful.
Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Lee, Lisalee, and I am representing myself, a person in long-term recovery from opioid use disorder, a concerned mother, and a doctoral candidate in public health. I'm also a multiple overdose survivor who is here before you today because my friends were not afraid to intervene and reverse my overdoses, as I am not afraid to intervene and reverse overdoses. Let me be clear that I too am concerned about fentanyl and have lost count of the friends who have died from overdoses. I am here to oppose SB 35 and SB 343 as these bills will kill. Decades of public health research has shown that prohibitive policies drive increasingly risky adulterants in the illicit drug supply, mass incarceration, and disproportionately impact people of color and the lowest level people on the supply chain, people with addiction. The state of Nevada at this time lacks mass spectrometry, quantitative drug checking capabilities that can extrapolate how much fentanyl is in 4 grams of heroin, or sugar for that matter. In a market in which most drugs on the illicit market at least have trace amounts of fentanyl from packaging or distribution. 4 grams of opioids is the weight of 4 paper clips, an amount a person may consume in a day. It is hardly trafficking. Further, unlike Colorado HR 22-1326, these bills contain no pathways for prevention, harm reduction, treatment, or recovery support, and therefore undermine the work of those of us in the trenches working to keep people alive. Further, it fails to address other adulterants of concern, such as nitazines, xylazine, and brophine, which will only cause further damage in this game of whack-a-mole. I urge you all to support prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and recovery services that have decades of scientific evidence that support their efficacy. I urge you to be led by evidence, not fear. These bills will kill. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Nadler, Nadler. I'm the co-founder of Moms Against Drugs and Drug Epidemic Awareness Walk Across America. In addition, I currently am an active member on the Surge Committee led by our Attorney General, Aaron Ford. I know his passion and I appreciate every single thing he does. And I am a mom speaking today who has been directly affected. I lost my son in 2008 to an overdose. It took me 3 years after losing him to realize and quite honestly understand exactly what everybody else who has lived went through, because all I wanted to do was put every single person in jail for the first couple of years. But sitting back, watching and seeing this play out, going from the heroin epidemic to the fentanyl epidemic, and nothing being done to prevent it. Watching my son having to detox to myself because there was nothing available in our city. I don't think anybody can imagine. If you close your eyes and even try to imagine your young child screaming, rolled up in a ball, curled up in pain, in agony, begging, pleading for help, and there were no resources here. And this was in 2010, and I'm still appalled that we don't have the resources. The reason I am opposing this bill is because there are so many gray areas, and I believe, and I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, Assemblywoman Luke, or whoever spoke about our children, that's what touched a chord with me. This bill, number one, it doesn't distinguish between minors, because as we all know in our state,
And
children
ma'am,
starting at the age of 12.
ma'am, thank you for
Yes.
your testimony. We are at 2 minutes, so if you could wrap it up and close it. Thank you for your testimony.
Yes, let me just thank you. We have children starting at the age of 12 beginning to experiment not only with marijuana and alcohol, but with prescription drugs and illicit substances, and they do not have the full comprehension of life experience to realize the dangers and risks. We have nothing in our classrooms set up to prevent this. We need to have mandated counselors, drug counselors, health counselors, drug programs in all the classrooms. And furthermore, the Narcan bill, it says shall in the classroom. It's not mandated. It needs to be mandated.
And ma'am,
for
thank
all
you
classes.
very much for your testimony.
But this
You
bill
can, ma'am, you can submit any additional written comments to the committee, but we are past the 2 minutes, so
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
thank you.
There are no callers to offer opposition at this time.
Thank you, Broadcasting. Now we'll go to neutral testimony on Senate Bill 35 and Senate Bill 343 here in Carson City. Anyone who is neutral and wishes to be heard.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Carla Wagner. I am a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. I have a procedural question, if I may. I have a prepared statement, but I also have some data that can respond directly to Senator Wynn and Senator Harris's questions that's not part of my statement. So I
Well,
don't know how to make that available to you.
You can submit anything you'd like to our committee secretary, but we're allotting 2 minutes per witness.
Okay.
So I'll start whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Carla Wagner, K-A-R-L-A-W-A-G-N-E-R. I am a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Nevada, Reno. I've been studying the health consequences of drug use and overdose for 20 years, 8 of those years in Nevada. The research evidence points towards 3 strategies that can reduce overdose deaths: scaling up medications to treat opioid use disorder, implementing evidence-based drug prevention programs, and supporting and expanding access to harm reduction tools such as Narcan to reverse overdoses. The evidence also shows that increased sentencing not only does not prevent overdose deaths, but can also increase drug-related harms. For example, in my research in Nevada, fear of law enforcement is a primary deterrent from seeking help during an overdose. People equate calling 911 for help with calling the police, and you even heard Nick Shepak do it earlier in his testimony. People simply will not call the police in response to an overdose, and people die. Fear of law enforcement also drives people towards solitary drug use, which is another primary risk factor for overdose death. Incarceration itself is a risk factor for overdose death. People recently released from prison have 10 to 12 times the risk for overdose compared to non-incarcerated people. And disrupting local drug selling networks is also a risk factor for overdose death. In this fentanyl-saturated market, people keep themselves safe by buying drugs from trusted sources. Arresting and incarcerating those sources drives people towards riskier drugs. Research has also shown in the early days of the opioid epidemic that restricting access to prescription opioids was associated with transitions to heroin and methamphetamine use. And now we're seeing fentanyl fill that void, and we're seeing xylazine emerge. Focusing on fentanyl might yield some short-term benefits, but in the long term, the market will respond with other more dangerous drugs. My team and I have done research on the prevalence of fentanyl in street drugs, including stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine. We've found fentanyl in trace amounts in about 21% of cocaine and about 4% of methamphetamine. We also know that seized pills like those fake M30s that people are talking about are largely comprised of other substances, not fentanyl. In one pill that was analyzed in a lab, it contained 44% of acetaminophen and 0.8% fentanyl. So in short, sentencing penalties can increase risk for overdose death through a number of different pathways, and I am aware of no evidence that increased penalties can reduce overdose deaths or substance use. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Barry Cole, B-A-R-R-Y-C-O-L-E in neutral, and just would like to kind of present a couple of observations. One, we heard about 6.5 tons of fentanyl being seized at the border. The problem is the DEA thinks that they only get about 5 to 10%. So that means 130,000 to 250,000 pounds got through if we only got 13,000 to start with. I know you will work incrementally because that's how government progresses. So we have 35, 170, 197, 343 that we'll have to play through, but the long goal is we're missing the point. The point is fentanyl comes from Mexico, pure and simple. It's not made in America unless it's pharmaceutical. Those precursors that made that drug in Mexico came from the People's Republic of China. We know that. So if we aren't going to, as the state of Nevada, do something to penalize Mexico and China, how do you think you're going to cut this off? It's not going to happen. And I assure you, as an undergrad at Berkeley in 1974 with a 6-foot resin column, you could give me any unknown sample in the biochem lab and I could tell you what was in it. If you don't want to hire Berkeley or UNR undergrads, you can send it to Millennium Labs for $1,000 to $1,500. They can tell you exactly what's in a sample, and they have many competitors, so get the best price. We can determine what's in pills, and we can do something about it. I'm not so sure what the legislation will do. Thank you.
All right, I don't see anybody else to give neutral testimony in Carson City. I'm not sure if we still have the room in Las Vegas. Okay, it sounds like that room has been turned over to another committee. So those individuals would have still been provided with the phone number on the agenda. So we will go to the phones now for neutral testimony.
Thank you, Chair. If you would like to offer neutral testimony on SB 35 and 343, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Thank you, Chair. There are no callers to offer neutral testimony at this time.
All right, then. I'll invite the sponsors back up to give closing remarks if you wish. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thanks for everyone who testified today. It's been obviously an important discussion, one that I knew would be difficult. This is a very tough issue to address, as proven by the fact that some want no penalties whatsoever, while some don't want medicated-assisted treatment required in the jails. That's a bridge that is difficult to overcome. That said, intent does matter. To the contrary of those who've said otherwise, intent does matter. My intent very well could have been to come in as a tough on crime guy who had no compassion for the end user, who sought only to punish those who were engaged in this particular arena, from the end user to the trafficker. Instead, my intent is to try to ascertain ways in which to provide assistance to the end user, to provide assistance to those who use drugs, and to, in fact, focus on those who are distributing and manufacturing those drugs. That is absolutely the intent, and it does matter. Not to the exclusion of effect, to be sure, because effect is important as well, which is the exact reason why I have asked those from every side of this issue to provide me assistance on ensuring that the effect aligns with my intent. Some have stonewalled me, frankly, and have said under no circumstance can they provide assistance in that regard, and that, again, will be borne out relative to those who testify in opposition without providing support on ways in which to bridge this. And tenor matters as well. Tenor does matter because, again, my approach could have been, I could care less what those opposing this bill feel, but instead my tenor has been, I believe, one of cooperativeness, acquiescence, and looking for opportunities, again, to find the compromise where appropriate and where capable. I would hope that this conversation continues. Clearly, we have a lot of work yet to do with those who are opposed to this bill. Reasonable minds can disagree. Let's be clear on that. Some argue this is a public health issue and has nothing to do with public safety. I think it's both. I think it's both. And I respectfully disagree with the notion that the only approach to addressing this issue is public health. That said, looking for opportunities to meld public health and public safety is the approach I've attempted to take. These are not mutually exclusive. They can be pursued simultaneously. And again, I encourage those who have ideas on both ends to present those and to pursue those. I will also remind those who are paying attention to this hearing and to these bills that nothing in these bills removes the ability of diversion courts, drug courts, and other opportunities to receive assistance as opposed to being sent to jail or to prison. And again, to the extent there are additional suggestions on ways the criminal justice system can approach this, then I would suggest that they be brought forward. I will close and tender the mic to Majority Leader Cannizzaro simply by saying there are some big differences between the 1980s and what we're doing today. You absolutely have two presenters who are concerned about the impact and effect that their intent and the language has in these bills. Some back then were only throw them under the jail. They were not smart on crime, they were tough on crime. And I don't endeavor to claim to be tough on crime. I want to be smart on crime and looking for the opportunity to address this issue in a holistic way And I would encourage those who have presented amendments to continue to work with us on that, and I would encourage those who have stonewalled us and not presented amendments to approach us with suggestions on ways to proceed. And with that, I say thank you so much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to present these bills.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Nicole Canizaro, Senate District 6, and it is always tough to follow the ever eloquent Attorney General in this regard, and I think he probably said it better than I am able to. The one thing that I think that sticks out to me is that, to the point that it does not have to be one or the other, it can both be a public health crisis that we can address with treatment and that can be addressed in a variety of other facets. Maybe some of those are not in this particular bill. I think that we can be dedicated to that and also recognize that there is additionally a place for a tool for law enforcement to address individuals who are helping to create what is a very big crisis. And I think that we can't lose sight of that. There are so many families who have lost kids to this, who have lost friends to this, and that is why we're having this discussion. Not because, and I think to the Attorney General's point, not because there was some, let's sit down at a table and figure out what's a bill that we could bring that just says, let's get, these higher penalties, and that's what we're going to come here and do for no reason. I think that what we have tried to do over the last few sessions that I have been in this building, what I have certainly tried to do, what I know this committee has endeavored to do and has done to a large extent, is to come up with legislation that doesn't treat everything exactly the same way and that does make considerations for things like treatment. Maybe to the point that you have seen that there are folks who are on one side of that or another, be it a public health crisis or a public safety crisis, who don't want to see the other side, and two individuals sitting before you who are trying to find the right balance to do both of those things simultaneously, I think speaks to the approach that we've certainly tried to have, and certainly that I know this committee has tried to have in other pieces of legislation. But I think that to walk away from this and not to address it at all is simply not a place that we can be for our constituents. To not be able to say that we have tackled something that we know is an issue, and there are plenty of statistics to delineate that fentanyl is absolutely a crisis in our communities, be they anecdotal or be they actual data points. There's no denying that fact. I think we can do both. This bill will not solve all of those problems simultaneously at once, but what it does do is provide a tool to law enforcement and also recognize that some of this stems and is born out of addiction, and how is it that we can address that? Be that through MAT treatment, how can we provide pieces in the legislation from Good Samaritan standpoints so that folks don't have to be afraid if it is an overdose situation, or it is a position where someone is taking fentanyl and is potentially in a life-threatening situation, that they can seek assistance. How can we create those spaces to allow for discretion and to allow for things to be treated appropriately and yet still provide the tool? I think that these bills are in a very good spot to move forward with that premise. Certainly happy to continue to speak with anyone who wants to help work on this issue and come up with a solution that is not, we can do nothing at all and walk away. I think the solution has to be, we do something. What does that mean? And it's going to mean a public safety aspect. It's also going to mean a public health aspect. And so I just want to thank the committee for your time and attention, and appreciate all of the good questions and your deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here and for your time and answering all of our questions. We certainly appreciate it. And with that, I will close the hearings on SB 35 and SB 343 and move to the last item on our agenda, which is public comment. Anybody wishing to give public comment here in Carson City is invited to the front now, but not seeing anybody, we'll go to the phones for public comment.
Thank you, Chair. If you would like to offer public comment today, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Thank you, Chair. There are no callers to offer public comment at this time.
All right, then that brings us to the conclusion of our meeting. Tomorrow we are scheduled again for 1 p.m. But we may be adjusting that based on all of the other committees. As you can see, we're all trying to be a little bit fluid here. So be on the lookout for that, but plan on being here at 1 o'clock tomorrow. And until that time, we are adjourned.